Друзі, вітаю! Мене звати Ігор Гаврищак, це YouTube-платформа 24 каналу.
Pleased to welcome Maxim Blunt. Maxim, let's start with the fact that Bloomberg says that a weakening of the ruble to 100 rubles per dollar is no longer a concern for the Russian authorities, as it could prove beneficial for the state budget. Amid planned spending increases next year, and the publication Moscow Times says Russian Federation is spending more than the annual budget of 80% of all regions on a week of war against Ukraine. And that's not the only thing let's talk about. Here's Bloomberg saying, citing a source, that the authorities in Russia no longer want to hold the dollar. What's more, it will be profitable. Is that true? Well, it has always been profitable, last year, this year, and 10 years ago. The higher the oil price, the better for the budget. The worse, of course, for the central bank, because a weak ruble means additional inflationary pressure. From the point of view of the budget, yes, of course. But it should be understood that the purchasing power of the ruble is also decreasing. And no one reacted to it in such a special way. Yes, there was no hysteria, and there were no threatening shouts from the Kremlin either. Yes, Bloomberg is probably right. They decided to ignore this political and psychological level, especially since the dollar has not really been, let's say, the main currency in Russia lately. The main one is the yuan. It is unusual. The yuan exchange rate is not monitored by many people, mostly those who are connected with finance or foreign trade. For the bulk of the population, the dollar is a marker anyway. But by and large, I think that they will just try to wash the dollar rate out of the information space somehow. Yes, well, they will simply not mention what the dollar exchange rate is now. That's it, yes. Maxim, explain it to me, because I have lived my whole life, and I know. I look in a money exchanger. If the exchange rate is high, it's bad. If it's low, it's good. But why is it like this now? Or is it good for the government, for buying everything you need? And for Russians themselves, why is it bad? Yes, if you have large foreign currency savings, it is probably a good thing. Well, it probably works. If you are Igor Ivanovich Sechin and you trade oil for foreign currency, and your company's expenses are in rubles, and you pay your wages in rubles, then the exchange rate of the dollar or the yuan or any other currency is good for you too. Well, or if you are a Mardoshov, you trade in steel or something else among major exporters and trade something abroad. If you are in the business of importing cars, you are no longer very happy. If you live in a country where the currency is weakening, but you have a currency salary, you are fine. If you have a ruble salary, you are bad. So there is no single rule here. The bulk of the population, of course, suffers, because a weak ruble means expensive imports, and imports are now quite a key thing for Russia to meet the needs of the population. But if you look at it from another point of view, at one time there was a lot of concern for domestic producers. The weak ruble is also good for them, because their goods are more competitive with imports. Well, in general, the problem now is not to sell goods, but to find someone who will produce them. So here it misses the target. The cheap ruble benefits quite a few people. Yes, it is not that the bulk of the population loses. Yes, consumers are suffering, producers are not so bad. If you think back to 1998, the fourfold devaluation that followed the default and the devaluation of the ruble was largely the basis for the subsequent multi-year growth of the Russian economy. All the zeros were partly due not only to the fact that oil was rising in price, but also to this devaluation. At the expense of hitting the population, the country's economy was doing quite well. Now, this is a blow past the target, because there is another problem. The problem is not that there's a lot of import competition in the Russian market of competitive goods, but the problem is that there is no one to produce. Here, devaluation will not help in any way. But in principle and theoretically, devaluation is not bad for the economy. Maxim, I was also thinking about how much Russia is spending on the war in Ukraine. Now I'm going to give you some figures, and you can tell me whether these are just figures and nothing to worry about, or whether they have serious consequences. Here, in 80% of the regions, more is spent on the war in Ukraine per week than on a year in these regions.
Цифры, а вы мне скажете, это просто цифры и ничего страшного, или это серьезные последствия?
And there are 4 regions, the republics, Ingushetia, Kalmykia, and the Nenets Autonomous District. They spend less on the maintenance of these regions per year than a day of war in Ukraine. How serious is this? Or are these just scary figures and the authorities don't care?
Меньше, чем день войны в Украине. Насколько это серьезно, или это просто страшные цифры?
Speaking of the regions, how are they reacting to this?
Если говорить об регионах, как они на это реагируют?
How do they only raise the pay of contract workers? We were discussing, I think, the Belgorod region, or the TVA Republic. In those regions where there is no military production, they solve problems by having part of the population go to fight. Yes, financial problems are solved in this way. It improves the statistics, money appears in the region, which somehow starts to be spent in a market way. As for the growth in military spending, I wouldn't overestimate it. Look, again, yes, literally over the summer, the cost of a recruit for the Ministry of Defense increased by 2.2 times. Therefore, there is no reason to say that the increase in military expenditures next year will lead to any serious cardinal change in the quantity or quality of armaments of those troops that are fighting. Yes, rubles are depreciating not only for the population, but also for the state. I think that if we somehow magically see what the situation is with assault rifles for these recruits, or machine guns or cannons or machine tools, we see a similar pattern. Maybe not by a factor of 1, but prices are still going up, and they're going up comparable to the way military spending is going up. The fact that the regions are suffering is not news to anyone. Yes, if we're talking about interbudgetary transfers, the bulk of the money that the regions receive from the center goes to pay contractors. The latest budget adjustment in the Belgorod region, there are some outrageous figures there, because dozens of times more money has been allocated for payments for signing a contract than for rebuilding houses.
Да, инфраструктура разрушается. Те регионы, которые могут хоть как-то худо-бедно себя обеспечивать, они обеспечивают себя сами. Там Татарстан, а те, у кого еще есть и какой-то...
Accordingly, yes, the infrastructure is being destroyed. Those regions that can somehow, even if poorly, provide for themselves, such as Tatarstan, and those who still have some military production, live relatively well, while the bulk of the regions with no military production or agricultural regions are now in a very unpleasant situation. Because the weather is also changing. The stratification is changing. Yes, if before the regions without oil were poor, now the regions without military production are getting poorer. By the way, Maxim, we remembered about oil. The Saudi princes and Ben Salman threatened to collapse oil and refused to go to Putin at the BRICS summit, because he received an invitation on October 22-24 in Kazan. We know that there will be a BRIC summit, refused, by the way, Kazakhstan. Tokayev, we will also remember. Sources say allegedly Saudi Arabia has threatened aka cut oil production. If I'm not mistaken, 2 million barrels a day to keep prices down. But now they are very worried, allegedly, that they are losing part of the market they influence. They could drop prices as low as $50 a barrel. How realistic is that? How likely is this development to happen? Well, theoretically, Saudi Arabia can lower the price to $5 a barrel, not just $50. It happens from time to time. Everybody remembers what happened in the 20th year when the price of oil dropped to $0 per barrel. I do not know to what extent the reason for Saudi Arabia's discontent is precisely Russia, but the fact that they very painfully perceive violations of the quotas allocated under OPEC Plus is indeed true. They have been warning for weeks and months that if this goes on, the price could fall for Saudi Arabia and for the Arab countries that usually support it in these kinds of punitive operations. The fall of this price is not critical for Russia. It is critical because Saudi Arabia, unlike Russia, has reserves, yes, currency reserves, financial reserves, and Russia has none left after the war started. That is, in fact, the way things are going. But I will remind you that now we cannot talk about the fact that next year, or at the end of this year, it will absolutely be $50 per barrel. Everything will depend on how events will develop in the relationship between Israel, Iran, Lebanon. In general, the Middle East is very turbulent at the moment, and Iran is quite capable of destabilizing the oil market. Maybe not for long, but if some nonsense starts in the Strait of Hormuz, the price could be not $50, but even $100 per barrel. Yes, not for a long time, but it can happen. So now we can guess on the coffee grounds as much as we want what the oil price will be. It will still be different. But you are right. If the price falls, Russia has no reserves of strength. This does not mean that the Russian economy will collapse and Putin will run to give up. No. It doesn't mean that Russian soldiers will have fewer weapons. It means that Russians will just eat bread without butter. When it comes to Russian Federation's shadow fleet, the Financial Times reports that Moscow's capacity to transport oil on old, uninsured vessels has grown by 70% since 2023. Maxim, please tell me, how can you fight against this? If, of course, it is cutting circles, looking for someone to take it, this fat natural gas from a field that is under sanctions, the Arctic with GHG2, and this also happens. Yes, the only thing that can be done here is targeted work with port infrastructures, with the authorities of those countries that accept these tankers. Threats, bribes, blackmail. How are children brought up?
Вторую или третью неделю нарезает кругами, ищет, кто бы его принял. Этот сжиженный природный газ, который с месторождения, которое под санкциями Арктика СПГ-2. Такое тоже случается. Да? Здесь единственное, что можно сделать, это целенаправленная работа с портовыми инфраструктурами, с властями тех стран, которые эти танкеры принимают. Угрозы, подкупы, шантаж. Как детей воспитывают, да?
The main methods of education are blackmail and bribery. In fact, with regard to the authorities of the countries that receive ships of the Shadow Fleet, we should act in roughly the same way, threatening secondary sanctions and offering some alternative. Yes, let's buy oil from Arab countries, or let's buy oil from Venezuela, for example, or from somewhere else. There is no other way.
Вот. По-другому никак.
Explain the difference between blackmail alone, then? It's pretty hard to get anything accomplished. We discussed when we were talking about China. You can't get anything by threats. You have to offer something in return, some kind of goodie. Let it be symbolic, but some kind of prize for the best fight against the Russian shadow fleet would probably be a good idea.
Было бы, наверное, неплохо. Ну, для тех стран, там, вот объявить, что начальник индийского порта...
For those countries, you could announce that the Indian port chief, who denies Russian ships from the shadow fleet the most, will get an annual bonus of, 10 bitcoins. Everything will be fine, and everything will be fine. I assure you. Maxim, explain to me, because I never fully understand, what is the difference for Russia, the sanctions and the shadow fleet? They are importing oil, and they are still transporting this oil. What is the difference between the shadow fleet and normal transportation? Normal transportation is possible on a vessel that is insured, and it can be insured only if the contract states that the price of oil is below the ceiling. Russian companies prefer, firstly, they are forbidden by Vladimir Putin's decree to sell prices below the ceiling and to specify this ceiling in the contract at all. And secondly, they want to sell more expensive, so they use the services of a shadow one. So it's very simple. Well, I want it this way. You want oil not at $60, but at $72. So you buy old tankers. Okay, then what are these sanctions affecting? They complicate the process of buying old tankers, as you must search for them, face potential port refusals, and the risk of sinking. With Chinese or Russian insurance, there may be disputes over coverage, leaving you exposed to risks without proper infrastructure support. Ultimately, it seems money takes precedence over these concerns. Plus, you are also showing valor to the leadership of the country you are doing business in. If, say, Lukoil or any other Russian oil company started signing export contracts stating that they were complying with international sanctions, they would be immediately subject to a Russian crackdown, and that would be it. The company's management would have changed. Igor Ivanovich Sechin would have come in, and he would have already transported with that fleet what he does now. That's all. Maxim, maybe I'm looking at this life with some rose-colored glasses, but when I was preparing for our interview, I found out that the Czech Republic spent 5 times more on buying Russian gas and oil than on military aid to Ukraine. They spent $1.5 billion there, and more than $7 billion on Russian oil and gas. Here's Bloomberg reporting that the EU is discussing the possibility of keeping Russian gas transit through Ukraine. How can this be explained? Double standards? It's cynical. Everyone is looking for their own benefit, because paying more for oil and gas than you help the country, while saying that we are sending shells is strange. There is an initiative of Peter Pavel, who talks about 5,000 shells, and here we have $7 billion for gas and oil and $1.5 billion for aid.
Знаете, мне сложно судить. Мы же обсуждаем сейчас не экономику, а морально-этические принципы.
You know, it's hard for me to judge. We are discussing moral and ethical principles, not economics. If I were a pastor, I would tell you how it is from the point of view of moral and ethical principles, especially when we are talking not about the country of which I am a citizen, but about some other country. The Czech Republic has a government that takes care of Czechs in this way, and it suits them. What are we going to discuss now, whether they are doing good or bad? We cannot put them in a corner or say, no, we will not take your shells because they are paid for with Russian oil. That won't work either. It is difficult for me to answer this question and give an assessment. The Czechs will decide for themselves what is more important for them, and we will deal with our own countries.
Да. БРИКС, саммит БРИКС 22-24 октября в Казани. Кстати, интересный...
The BRICS summit is scheduled for October 22 to 24 in Kazan, where authorities have reportedly advised against using old cars to avoid showcasing the region's financial struggles. Meanwhile, Russia aims to reduce its dollar dependence post-sanctions, and the BRICS payment system could potentially save billions. Discussions on bilateral agreements between the central banks of BRICS countries are expected at the summit. How realistic is it that BRICS will become a financially independent alternative to Western countries and the European Union? Talks about BRICS becoming an independent alternative to the West and the European Union have been going on since BRICS was created, around 2009. After the 2008 crisis, China, Russia, and some other countries began to talk about the unfairness of the global financial system.
И примерно с 2009 года, да, вот после кризиса 2008 года китайцы, Россия и...
One simple fact speaks for Russia's place in this structure. The BRICS Development Bank was created in due time. There is the World Bank, which deals with the development of the whole world, and the BRICS decided to make their own. One of the main sponsors of this bank was Russia. At that time, petrodollars were plentiful, and China, Russia, and some other countries were the main sponsors. After the outbreak of war and the imposition of international sanctions, the international structure of the BRICS Development Bank terminated all relations with the Russian Federation. Draw conclusions about what they can agree on in Kazan if the main financial structure of BRICS complies with international sanctions. I'm not going to comment further. While there may be discussions and handshakes, the BRICS International Development Bank will not reverse its decision or resume relations with Russia, including its banks and regions, nor will it reinstate programs halted after the war began. Maxim, Kazakhstan will refrain from joining BRICS. It is said with these explanations. There is a very long, supposedly multi-layered explanation, but why does Kazakhstan not want to join for the same reasons that you just voiced, or perhaps for other reasons? Listen, what kind of structure is BRICS?
Настолько разные и политические, и экономические, и географические страны, как Южная Африка, Бразилия.
How is it different when you have such different political, economic, and geographical countries like South Africa, Brazil, and India? You have all sorts of other members that are big but have nothing in common with each other. And India has such a relationship with China that it is strange to see them in the same structure.
Очень странно их наблюдать в одной структуре. Изначально БРИКС – это потенциальный лидер. Сейчас Россия вообще выбивается из этого.
Initially, BRICS was a potential leader, but now Russia is out of this potential as an economic leader because it has failed to live up to expectations. Instead of modernization, it got something incomprehensible, a dictatorship with technological degradation. China is still regarded as a potential leader. India, perhaps, too. And Brazil has also largely lost its potential. These are such different countries that Kazakhstan, which already participates in many more meaningful alliances, including with China and Russia, sees no point in joining BRICS. Why breed entities? What kind of organization is BRICS? No one has yet explained what its goals are. It is also completely unclear what they want and what they are trying to achieve. No one has explained it to me clearly so far, except that these are some big countries with emerging economies. Russia lacks workers in these professions.
Я так понимаю, если я правильно понимаю, это опять атака на мигрантов.
Well, look, doctors, physicians, I don't know, teachers in Russia. There will be much less need for teachers in Russia in the foreseeable future, because women don't give birth. Yes, if there are no children, there is no need for teachers. Everything is quite reasonable and logical here. Why would Russia need so many teachers, or kindergarten teachers, if there are no children? With doctors, things are a little different, because when there is a war in the country, even without a war, when your population is aging at such a rate, then, in general, doctors are not superfluous. It's a rather strange approach. When we fight migrants, we rely on our own strength. Someone told them that robots will solve all problems. Someone told them that everything that does not kill us makes us stronger, and import substitution. Just recently, by the way, there was a remarkable study by the Center for Macroeconomic Analysis and Short-Term Forecasting that if mass robotization began in Russia, 12 to 15 million workers would be freed up.
Центра макроэкономического анализа краткосрочного прогнозирования о том, что вот если бы в России началась массовая роботизация, высвободилось 12-15.
And then the country would get rid of the labor shortage, and the market would return to its normal state when employers, not employees, dictate conditions. Yeah, and so on and so forth. And it turned out, they came to a surprising conclusion.
И оказалось, знаете, они пришли к удивительному выводу. Ну, сейчас про санкции говорить довольно опасно, потому что если вы говорите об эффективности санкций...
Well, it is quite dangerous to talk about sanctions now, because if you talk about the effectiveness of sanctions in the Russian Federation, you can be accused of political myopia. So they concluded that what is preventing this robotization is cheap labor in Russia. Everyone thought that there was a wage race, and now business is groaning under the weight of the unaffordable wages they have to pay. It turns out that it is not. It is cheap labor. In fact, this concept fits into it. Let's get rid of migrants now, create an even worse labor shortage in the Russian economy, and maybe this will make Russian business look for money and opportunities to buy robots in China and bring them to Russia and install them in a factory. But by and large, it is much more likely that Russian business will hit the sheets, crawl into the graveyard, simply sell off everything they can, and live off whatever they manage to raise. Everything that could be saved. Here is Volodin's logic. It is approximately the same. Yes. Well. Yes. He spoke out. He had to justify his stay there as Speaker of the State Duma. It is necessary to periodically speak out with some timely initiatives from his point of view. Well. He spoke out. Well, somehow. Well, he said another stupidity. Well, yes, it happens, as a rule. So with Volodin. Maxim, thank you very much for this conversation. Let Volodin say that regularly, and you and I will talk about it. You will explain it to me. And yes, Volodin, by the way, at one time proposed to take apartments away from those who ran away like me and give them to war veterans. Well, so far this initiative has not materialized. This too, i.e. Duma initiatives are such a thing. Whatever the Kremlin decides, that's how it will be. Just in case, the ground can be probed. Why not? Maxim, thank you very much for the conversation. Thank you for taking the time to talk about these statements, and decisions, this whole fairy tale world. Thank you very much. Thank you. All right, have a good day and evening. Let me remind our viewers, we had economist Maxim Bland with us. You will traditionally like this video, comment, subscribe, and of course, that's how algorithms work, so share.
Мене звати Ігор Гаврищак. З вами побачимось в ефірі 24 каналу.